Listen to your own mornings for a moment. Not the noise of the world, but the quiet weight that meets you before you even open your eyes. That strange heaviness you keep misinterpreting as laziness or lack of discipline. Most men do. They think, something is wrong with me, when the deeper truth is far less personal and far more revealing. The bed isn't just where you sleep. It has become the place where your psyche delivers messages you've been too exhausted to hear. There's an unconscious mistake you may have been making for years, assuming that if you can't get out of bed easily, it must be a flaw in your character, rather than a sign your inner world is refusing to cooperate with the terms of your current life. That misinterpretation quietly erodes your self-respect. It makes you blame the symptom instead of decoding the message, and when shame replaces curiosity, the body speaks louder. In many men's lives, the bed slowly becomes a symbol with more archetypal weight than they realize. At times, it feels like a womb, a regression into a pre-demand world where nothing is expected of you and no one is watching. Other mornings, it resembles a coffin, a slow burial of unused will, a place where potential lies still, and the air feels thick with the dust of things postponed. And sometimes it becomes the hermit's chamber, a space where truth is too audible, where silence refuses to lie to you, where the life you're living and the life you're meant to live collide in the dark. If you pay attention, the sensation isn't ordinary fatigue. It's heavier, engineered almost, as if gravity itself is correcting you. A psychic veto, a quiet but firm refusal. It's the body saying, not like this, not again. And that kind of heaviness doesn't come from a bad night's sleep. It comes from an inner world that no longer trusts your waking life. This is where many men fall into another illusion, the cultural indictment that craving bed all day means weakness, that a real man pushes through, rises early, conquers the morning. But clinicians have been observing something different for years. The nervous system will often shut down when the life it's being asked to live is chronically misaligned. Collapse becomes protest, not comfort. Stillness becomes a way of saying, I cannot continue pretending. You might notice a part of you that refuses to rise is the same part that has spent years fixing everything, absorbing everything, performing competence while quietly falling apart. The exhaustion isn't about sleep. It's about carrying a life that no longer fits the shape of your integrity. And when this happens, archetypes begin to shift inside you. The Dormant King appears, the part of you that once directed your life, but now waits silently for a decree you no longer believe in. The exhausted warrior, blade dulled, stands at the edge of the bed, unsure if another battle is worth it. And in the background, an inner court circles restlessly, sensing that the man who used to lead them is questioning the entire kingdom. Underneath all this, there is plurality, several internal forces converging at once. Trauma-induced freeze, learned helplessness, depressive spirals, spiritual burnout, relational overextension. Different masks worn by the same withdrawal impulse. The psyche retreats when the external world asks for what the internal world can no longer supply. Here is a reframing to hold gently. Craving the bed isn't a collapse of willpower. It's a collapse of trust in the life you are currently negotiating. And if you stay with me through this, when we reach the midpoint of this essay, we'll uncover a mechanism men almost never recognize. How late mornings quietly evolve into a form of self-erasure, not because you want to disappear, but because part of you believes disappearing is the only safe option left. This is where our exploration begins. There is a moment many men know but rarely name. You wake with your body horizontal, still as stone, yet somewhere inside, your system feels braced, as if an impact already happened or is about to. It is a strange contradiction. Stillness on the outside, emergency on the inside. And most men interpret this as personal failure rather than physiological truth. They tell themselves they are procrastinating, avoiding wasting time, when the reality is far more primal. The body has entered a state it never learned to exit. This state is often misread. What looks like laziness from the outside may actually be the freeze response, one of the oldest survival strategies the nervous system has. It appears in moments when neither fight nor flight seems possible. Studies in PubMed Central describe this as an organism going rigid when escape is impossible. For many men, this happens not because of a single event, but because of the atmosphere in which they learned to grow up. Homes where volatility taught them that visibility meant danger, where being quiet, compliant, or invisible was the safest option. Stillness became a shield long before it became a habit. And so the bed becomes the stage where that shield reactivates. A man lies down thinking he is resting, but what is actually happening is something closer to self-erasure, a withdrawing from the field of conflict, a quiet hope that if he stays unseen, he cannot be found lacking, freeze disguised as rest. Yet the cost is that every hour spent in bed confirms a narrative he never consciously chose, that being absent is safer than being present. Another dynamic joins this without being invited. Learned helplessness. Science Direct describes it as the body's shorthand for futility. After enough attempts that yielded no meaningful change, the system stops attempting altogether. Not out of apathy, but out of exhausted logic. Many men raised on the mantra of pushing through fail to recognize this. They think their discipline evaporated. But the hidden reversal is this. Their discipline was confiscated by a system that concluded that effort is hazardous, that trying again will lead to disappointment, criticism, or collapse. This reframing can be unsettling. It suggests the body is not betraying you. It is protecting you based on outdated but once necessary calculations. And here is a quiet truth that may feel slightly confronting, the kind a man pauses the video for. The part of you gripping the mattress might not be quitting. It might be striking. It might be refusing to reenact a battlefield you never mourned leaving. Clinicians who work closely with men report a recurring pattern. Bodies staging silent strikes. Bodies refusing to escort their owners back into exploitative workplaces, chaotic relationships, or roles that feel like slow erosion. This does not make the pattern ideal or harmless. It simply means the shutdown is not random. It is contextual. The bed mirrors the threat landscape your nervous system still anticipates. One way to sense this is to notice the difference between rest and freeze. Rest restores. Freeze tranquilizes while draining. Men often wake from hours in bed feeling heavier, not lighter. Inputs feel overwhelming. Notifications feel like demands. The smallest task feels futile. The verdict forms quietly. Starting is pointless. That verdict is not reasoning. It is a survival reflex misapplied to modern life. Here is another reframing to hold gently. If freeze is the emergency brake, then something deeper is keeping that brake locked. An invisible software made of rumination, emotional residue, and unprocessed memory. And 2 chapters from now, you will hear a story from a man who realized that what he called resting was actually a rehearsal for disappearing. For now, stay with the simple truth that your stillness is not emptiness. Something inside is braced for impact, even when your body doesn't move. There is a moment in this experience that often goes unnoticed. The body is horizontal, unmoving, but the mind is wide awake, running laps in a stadium no one else can see. Men describe lying in bed for hours while the mind rehearses possibilities, regrets, conversations, futures that never arrive, and catastrophes that may never happen. It feels productive for a moment, almost responsible, as if thinking enough could make the day safer. But something quieter is happening beneath the noise. The mind is trying to compensate for a body that no longer trusts movement. Many men believe this mental overdrive is a sign of intelligence or preparation, but often it is a form of protection, a belief that if they mentally pre-solve everything, they will finally feel ready to rise. Yet readiness never arrives. Every loop ends where it begins, only with more doubt. Perfectionism thrives here. The fantasy that one more round of thinking will finally provide the courage that never seems to materialize. It is a seductive illusion. The idea that clarity can be earned without risk, without stepping into the world that once felt unsafe. In Jungian terms, this is where the shadow enters quietly, not as darkness or chaos, but as a pattern of intellectualization posing as depth. A reliance on thought as armor rather than thought as insight. The man appears contemplative, but inside he is negotiating fear. Inside he is bargaining with his own history, and the stillness of the body becomes the perfect incubator for these negotiations. Neuroscience adds another layer. During taskless states, the brain's default mode network becomes highly active. PubMed Central studies show that the DMN amplifies self-referential thought, meaning the mind turns inward, looping on identity, failure, imagined futures, unresolved pasts. In depressive states, the DMN can lock into repetitive circuits that corrode agency. The bed becomes its amphitheater. No interruption, no friction, no external grounding. Only you and an internal prosecutor who never tires. Here is a reframing that can shift how you see this pattern. What feels like strategy is often sabotage in formal wear. The mental planning, the rethinking, the replaying. Many men believe it is discipline, but for a significant number, it is structured self-doubt. A way of creating so many theoretical scenarios that action becomes impossible. Survivors in online communities speak of entire days lost to planning for a life they never step into. Hours spent calculating possibilities while the body remains anchored to the bed, convinced that movement would expose them to criticism, rejection, or failure. The archetype that emerges here is the wounded magician. All intellect, little directed will. Brilliant in thought, hesitant in embodiment, not because of weakness, but because the mind became a safer terrain than the external world, and the bed became the threshold he could not cross. If you want to sense where this pattern lives in you, consider a few quiet questions. Does the thought you are looping on generate a clear next step? Or does it simply produce another layer of the same thought? Does it feel fresh? Or is it an old fear wearing new language? And when you exit the loop, do you feel steadier or smaller? These questions are not instructions, but mirrors. They reveal the difference between reflection and rumination. Here is another gentle destabilizer, a truth many men feel but rarely speak aloud. Once thinking becomes safer than acting, the psyche reorganizes around stillness. The day is forfeited long before the morning is over, and the man who appears to be resting is often a man wrestling with an invisible architecture of self-protection that no longer matches the life he wants. This chapter closes with a single idea to hold. The bed is not just where the body rests. It is where the mind asks itself whether it trusts you to rise. There comes a point in this descent where the psychology becomes less about energy and more about identity. Not the identity you present to the world, but the one you negotiate with in the quiet hours. For many men, the bed does not simply represent exhaustion. It becomes the place where an internal ruler steps down, a dethroning, a subtle abdication that no one else witnesses, but that reshapes the entire architecture of a life. Some men only feel safe emerging when they believe they can be immaculate, when their performance is flawless, their competence unquestionable, their presence polished. The moment they sense a crack in that image, the instinct is to disappear, not out of vanity, but out of old conditioning. Many overachievers grew up in environments where approval was conditional, where affection followed achievement, where visibility came with scrutiny. For them, the bed is not only a retreat, but a protective chamber, a place where they cannot be evaluated, compared, or exposed. Inside this pattern, the father wound often hums quietly. Not necessarily the father himself, but the inherited script that worth must be earned, proven, displayed. When a man internalizes that script, rest is rarely rest. Disengagement becomes self-protection. If worth comes from output, then the moment output falters, the self feels at risk. The bed becomes a refuge from that threat. Jung's lens adds another dimension. The inner king, the part of you that orients your days and chooses your direction, starts to dim. He does not vanish, he simply withdraws. And in his absence, the inner critic rises. The servant takes over. You start living reactively, not sovereignly. Mornings unfold without your authorship. Days proceed as if scripted by a committee you never agreed to join. The inner realm continues to operate, but without a central authority holding the vision. Men describe this experience as losing themselves, when in reality, they have been displaced inside their own psyche. A difficult truth follows, one that requires gentleness to hear. Perfectionism becomes both tyrant and prisoner. It drives the collapse it later condemns. The man who expects himself to be flawless is the same man who hides when he inevitably isn't. The standard becomes a cage, and the bed becomes its padded interior. Here is a reframing that often stirs something deep. When a man says, "I don't care anymore," he is rarely telling the truth. More often, he cares so intensely that the emotional cost of trying again feels unbearable. Apathy becomes a blanket, not a philosophy, but a shield. Nietzsche warned that losing one's why leads to a form of nihilism, not because meaning disappears, but because the pursuit of meaning begins to feel dangerous. The psyche doesn't reject purpose, it rejects humiliation. It rejects living a life that wounds dignity. Before the midpoint of this journey, something else tends to surface. A man may find himself in bed, not because he's tired, but because he's trying to avoid re-entering a world that recently rejected him. One man shared, after a painful breakup, that he lay in bed for days, not asleep, but suspended. He realized later that he was not resting. He was rehearsing absence, preparing to be someone who no longer occupied space. It was not a conscious choice, but an emotional rehearsal for vanishing. This is where the next movement of the story begins to take shape. When the king abdicates, something else rushes in to fill the vacuum. Not purpose, not vision, but algorithms, screens, small pleasures with no direction. The bed becomes both throne and escape hatch. And 2 chapters from now, we will look at how some men turn that same threshold into a doorway back into their own lives. For now, hold this single thread. The man you once were has not disappeared. He has stepped aside, waiting for a life he can re-enter with dignity. There is a point in the descent where the bed no longer functions only as a shield from overwhelm. It becomes a quiet refuge for small, predictable comforts. Not the deep kind that nourishes a man, but the soft, numbing kind that asks nothing of him. Morning lights up the room, but instead of rising, the hand reaches for the phone, for notifications, for scrolling, for quick stimulation that requires no exposure and no risk. The bed turns into a private console where a man can experience micro-pleasures without ever having to face the unpredictable texture of real life. These soft addictions do not announce themselves with drama. They are subtle. They offer just enough dopamine to distract from ache, boredom, longing, or fear. And over time, the pattern begins to replace desire with distraction. Longing for connection gets replaced with conversations online that never quite touch the heart. The need for meaning dissolves into loops of videos that ask nothing of the viewer. Hunger for direction is pacified by endless content designed to keep a man watching rather than acting. It is not indulgence, it is anesthesia. Neuroscience has a way of illuminating this. Dopamine is not a pleasure chemical, it is an anticipation chemical. It governs the expectation of reward. When a man's life has delivered repeated disappointment or rejection, the brain starts to devalue effort. The friction of trying feels too costly. Low-resistance stimulation becomes more attractive because it does not carry the risk of failure. PubMed Central studies describe this shift in expectation as a recalibration of the reward system. The brain begins to privilege what is predictable over what is meaningful. This is how a loop forms. Lie down, avoid, stimulate, numb, repeat. It is quiet, self-reinforcing, and deceptively soothing. A man may think he is recovering, but the body reveals a different truth. He feels overstimulated, yet drained, buzzing, but empty, temporarily occupied but not restored. What he calls rest is often a continuation of the same threat response, just dressed in softer colors. Here is a reframing that can loosen the shame around this pattern. The pursuit of comfort is not the problem. It is the exhaustion underneath it. The deeper issue is that these pleasures do not let a man meet himself. They detour him from his inner world. They offer escape without direction. And because they demand nothing, they return nothing. The result is a peculiar kind of fatigue, not the fatigue of work, but the fatigue of avoidance. There is also something revealing in what happens when these comforts are removed, when the phone is out of reach, when the familiar distractions pause. Emotion rushes in. Bargaining begins. The hand searches for something to soften the edges, not because the man is weak, but because the loop was holding back feelings he rarely has space to name. Loneliness, uncertainty, a quiet belief that he has drifted from a life he once imagined for himself. And here is the destabilizing but clarifying line for this chapter. Avoidance is not emptiness. It is unprocessed meaning waiting for your return. When a man begins to see the loop clearly, another question often arises. What part of reality feels too sharp to touch each morning? And what would make re-entry feel possible again? Not heroic, not disciplined, simply possible. This question prepares the ground for the next chapter, where the bed stops being a refuge and begins to resemble a borderland between the life a man endures and the life he has not yet claimed. There comes a morning when the man is not simply tired, not simply avoiding, not simply overstimulated. Something deeper shapes his hesitation. The world outside the bed begins to feel like terrain marked with invisible warnings. Not because the world itself changed, but because his nervous system stored a map of old experiences and never updated it. Rising from bed becomes less about energy and more about threat perception. The threshold between mattress and floor feels like crossing into a territory where past versions of him were overwhelmed, dismissed, or depleted. What many men discover, often too late, is that their delay in getting up has little to do with the act of rising itself. The hesitation is tied to what they believe they are rising into: a misaligned job where their gifts have no place, a relationship where their needs go unnamed, a family system where boundaries collapse the moment they are spoken. The psyche holds score. It remembers where authenticity was punished and where silence was rewarded. The body learns to anticipate these environments before the mind can name them. And so it stalls, buying time, negotiating safety in a way that looks like procrastination but feels like survival. Another reframing emerges here. Avoidance is not always fear of effort. Often it is fear of entering a relational field where a man has no authority, where he feels himself shrink, where the cost of presence outweighs the reward. The shadow dynamic at play is not laziness, but relational powerlessness. The bed becomes the last space where a man feels protected from being pulled into roles that exhaust him. Mythology provides language for this inner experience. In ancient stories, the underworld is never the final destination. It is a descent for the sake of finding what was lost. The bed acts similarly. It becomes a chamber of descent, not a dwelling, a place where the man meets the parts of himself that resent the compromises he has made, the part that says yes when he aches to say no, the part that bows when he longs to stand. Jung would say that the shadow gathers in these places, not to harm, but to be acknowledged. Here is the destabilizing truth for this chapter. Rising is not the point. What you rise into is. A man can set 10 alarms, place the clock across the room, rehearse morning routines, and still collapse back into the sheets if the day he is rising into violates his values. The body refuses what the psyche cannot accept. The nervous system does not obey motivational speeches. It obeys alignment. And yet there is a quiet path that many men discover when the pressure to transform dissolves. It is not the path of conquering the morning, but of touching reality once. One honest conversation, one boundary held, one meaningful act that signals to the psyche that the world outside is not solely a place of depletion. This is not a strategy, but a reorientation, a way of helping the body risk emergence without demanding heroism. This chapter leads us toward the final insight. The bed was never only about sleep. It was a mirror, a gate, a soft refusal. And what it has been trying to tell you is not that you lack discipline, but that you have outgrown the life you keep waking into. As we arrive at the final moments of this exploration, something becomes clear that may have been difficult to name before. The bed you return to each night and struggle to rise from each morning is not only a piece of furniture. It is a mirror, a place that reflects the fractures you conceal socially, the compromises you rationalize, the exhaustion you normalize, and the quiet truths you postpone. But if left uninterpreted, that same mirror can slowly turn into a mausoleum, a chamber where parts of you lie down not to rest, but to be forgotten. The patterns we traced, freeze, helplessness, rumination, dopamine loops, the father wound, masculine shame, are not separate illnesses. They converge into a single message. Something inside you is rejecting the current terms of your life. Michigan medicine describes this kind of collapse not as moral failure, but as the psyche expressing limits that the conscious mind has ignored. The heaviness that keeps you in bed is not testimony against your character. It is testimony against misalignment. It is the body saying, enough of this direction. This brings us to an identity shift that matters more than any technique or routine. You are not the man who cannot get up. You are the man whose psyche refuses to move on command until integrity is restored. The symptom is not proof of weakness. It is evidence of revolt, a quiet rebellion against a way of living that no longer honors the deeper truth of who you are becoming. And here is the final reframing to carry with you. The shift you are seeking is not about earlier mornings or stricter habits. It begins with interpreting the collapse as information. as data about overload, misalignment, or unprocessed hurt. When a man treats his exhaustion as feedback instead of flaw, the way forward becomes less about force and more about recalibration. The body softens. The inner king stirs. A sense of direction returns not as pressure, but as possibility. The question beneath everything we explored is simple. Will you inhabit your life or fade in installments beneath the sheets? Not as a demand, not as a test, but as a doorway. Presence is not performance. Presence is the moment you negotiate new terms with yourself. And if any part of this resonated, it can be clarifying to name the signal your bed has been giving you. A thought that repeats, a feeling that lingers, a ritual that has become a clue. Sometimes the simple act of naming reveals the path you have been circling all along.